ever deal for a private prison in Israel, holding that it would violate the right to dignity to have somebody making a profit out of essentially guarding you, punishing you in a prison setting. The third question had to do with the Prison Rape Elimination Act and why it doesn't apply to ICE detention facilities. I'd say generally, ICE, which as you know is the Immigration Control and Enforcement Agency, immigration detention is a huge part of mass incarceration that I haven't really had time to talk about. It used to be tiny. It's blown up just like our prison population has. The first thing and most important thing you need to know about it is the constitutional rights that we can at least fight to apply to prisoners in cases like Brown versus Plata, by and large don't apply to immigration detainees because they're in this netherland of this imaginary idea that they're not being punished because they're in a civil detention rather than a criminal one. That's a real problem.
We'll talk about this next week when we do immigrant rights.
The question about was also asked, well, what did Brown versus Plata actually do? What did the May decision do? Well, the most important thing it did was simply uphold what the three-judge court had done. The three-judge court had ordered the reduction of the prison population by 40,000. And, again, there are two ways of looking at that. You can either say, well, gee, we had 180,000 prisoners. Now we're going to reduce it by 40,000. That's good, but on Simon's chart, we're still way up there, and we might just eventually build more prisons and get back to 180. Indeed, 10 years ago, the state was projecting a 250,000 population prison system by now. They were planning to just keep growing. So it might just be a hiccup on the road to permanent mass incarceration. My hope, though, is really twofold. One, simply by making California do an experiment to see if you can actually keep people out of prison without blowing up the crime rate, they're going to give us an opportunity to challenge this false criminological premise that it makes people safer in California communities to move other people to prisons. We can challenge that. Secondly, I believe that mass incarceration has been premised on a willingness to ignore the humanity of inmates. And the reason I had that image up of the Red Cross that I didn't have a chance to show you, the history of the Red Cross in the 19th century is really fascinating. I don't know if you've had a chance to study it in this class, but up until the middle of the 19th century, there was no provision made for soldiers who got wounded on the battlefield. You were just left to die. And it was compatible with a world that basically saw you as an enemy and not a human being. And what the Red Cross came out of was a sort of moment of consciousness where Europe kind of said, even an enemy becomes a human being again once they're injured, right?
We read that probably.
Oh, you did. So think about California's prisons packed full of these very sick inmates as a kind of humanitarian crisis, not unlike that gave rise to the Red Cross. I guess we're just about out of time. The PLRA, yes, precisely. It allows people like Joe Arpaio to get their day in court again and again and again, and to have that as an opportunity to block change. And finally, Professor LaCour's question about cruel and unusual punishment. I can give this to you in a nutshell. Cruel and unusual punishment is our language where we should have a prohibition on degrading inhuman, a prohibition on torture, degrading, and inhuman treatment. That's the more modern human rights language. We have the earlier language that comes from the English Civil War, basically the 17th century. Now here's the good news. That language is vacuous. It doesn't really tell us much. And so the important thing is, what do courts look to inform those very broad terms? And what Plata tells us is that from now on, what they should look to, and let me put it back up there, is dignity, right? Dignity is going to inform the meaning of the Eighth Amendment. And if that's true, you can begin to challenge LWOP, you can begin to challenge supermax prisons as incompatible with dignity, you can begin to challenge collateral consequences where people can't get a job after prison as incompatible with dignity. So it either stands for the very narrow proposition that you can't forget that someone's a human being, or it stands for the very broad proposition that you have to treat somebody like they're a human being. And in between those two is all about what we can make our leaders do with this opportunity. And I hope to have a chance to talk with you about this in the coming months.
Thank you so much.